Europa League. It's back, not in the way that we remember it, and there are some biggies in terms of teams in it this time around, but they're not doing as well as you would expect, Lars.
No, there have been a few wrinkles early on in the season. I was about to say, almost most predictably, Man United have messed up. Like we are on the continent. We're not going to go straight to Premier League stuff, but like Man United messing up against FC Twente was it was kind of funny because I didn't watch that game, so I saw the angry messages on social media before I saw the goal they conceded, and I just saw a lot of Man United fans going, "Oh, for God's sake, this again!" And then I saw the goal. It's just an opposing team just running through their entire team as if there was no midfield there. I was like, "Oh, that's Gans. That's what used to happen." But no, we've seen early doors. There have been a few surprising results, and I think such is the joy of the Europa League. The listeners to OTC, the sort of savvy Euro-focused listeners, I think will know that for quite a while the Europa League has kind of often been a more fun tournament than the Champions League, I would argue. It's almost as if, because for some teams the stakes are a bit lower, people chill out a little bit more. It's an entertaining tournament, I think.
And of course, you do a bit of Portuguese in your spare time, Andy. Porto, well, I don't know what the backlash was for them, considering their defeat in this, but they're teams that we're talking about are teams that you're more used to seeing in the Champions League rather than the Europa League. Yeah. What's going on?
Yeah, that's right. I think if you look at Manchester United, Porto, Galatasaray, the three big ones from the opening night, really, who you would expect to be in the competition above. But the Porto night was interesting. Of course, the game that sort of, along with AZ, kind of kicked off the Europa League, won the two early kickoffs, and I don't want to say Porto set themselves up for failure, but the two main topics of conversation before going away to Bodo Glimt, I cannot underline that enough. Going away to Bodo Glimt. They could have given Jose Mourinho a call first off if they'd wanted to know exactly what it's like and exactly what can happen. And we'll go over to Lars for that in a second. But André Villas-Boas gave a slightly snooty speech on the eve of the game about, when we won the Europa League in 2011, it was absolutely glorious when I was the coach, etc. Something's expected of this club in this competition. Perhaps overlooking the fact that they are gradually getting back to being a competitive team, having quite a lot of financial challenges at the moment, having had a significant squad makeover and not being up there with, I don't think, even potentially the greatest Porto teams of recent times. And the main subject in the press conference before the game is Vitor Bruno, the coach, who was the assistant to Sergio Conceição last season. He's always in shorts, and the main question for him was, are you going to be wearing shorts? And he said, well, in Norway, that would be absolute madness, and then kind of left the end of the sentence just hanging there. He did wear trousers and a jacket in the end, but I think that was the only way in which they were really prepared.
This is not actually the first time André Villas-Boas has got unstuck in northern Norway to an extent, because, when he was in charge of Tottenham, they played away to Tromsø, which is even further to the north.
Yes.
And it was one of those late autumn European games when it was all snowy in Tromsø, and they had to bring the tractor out just before the kickoff to get rid of snow from the pitch. Now, they did win Tottenham on that day, but I think it was still a big fat L for Villas-Boas, I think, on a personal level. Because he was rumbled. There was a man in the crowd at Tromsø, like a local hairdresser, who started chanting that he was getting sacked in the morning. and Villas-Boas lost his rag and had him ejected. Well, so he had this random Norwegian guy ejected from the stadium for chanting that he was getting sacked in the morning, presumably in a heavy Norwegian accent. I can see how that would be aggravating.
I can hear you chomping at the bit to bring in the Bodo.
I've already hijacked this into the Norwegian football hour.
Go on then, Glimt.
The Norwegian football hour. No, listen. I would say, okay, I always come on here to talk about Bodo Glimt because they're great. But I do think this is arguably their greatest sort of result in Europe, I would say, even allowing for the fact that they actually thumped Jose Mourinho's Roma, but that was a heavily rotated Roma. And what they did here against Porto, who haven't made that many changes from the weekend. It was a pretty strong side. They went down to 10 men in the second half. And against one of the real tournament favorites, one of the real powerhouses, a team you don't really expect to see in the Europa League. And they managed to hang on and actually extend their lead and then get the 3-2 win in the end. So doing almost the entire second half with a man down against a team like Porto, I think is absolutely extraordinary. And there are no caveats about rotation or anything. This was just an incredible result. It's a little bit bittersweet to see them do this now, given that they kind of crumbled a little bit in the Champions League qualifier away to Red Star. That was not their best game, but it is an interesting quirk that, going away to Bodo Glimt, going to the Arctic Circle and playing on an artificial pitch, I think is going to be a shock to quite a few games. It's like it's an environment and an atmosphere and a setting they're not used to, and that probably does give Bodo Glimt a little bit of an edge. But then Bodo Glimt themselves, on the other hand, have to learn what it's like to go away to these European venues, to go away to Belgrade and play Red Star and handle occasions like that, and that's part of a learning process for them. I would argue that Bodo Glimt, we talk about some of the big teams who shouldn't maybe be in this tournament. I'm not sure Bodo Glimt should be in this tournament. I think they should be in the Champions League, but they in the qualifier just couldn't get it done. But they're showing by beating Porto that there's a lot here. And I could clearly go on about this for like an hour, and I won't. But one thing I'd like to note, if we're looking at like what is the secret to Bodo Glimt's success, I think it's interesting to note that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 players in the starting 11, so half the starting 11, were players who have been successful at Bodo Glimt, moved on, tried to play in a bigger country, and found out that this is no fun, and gone back again. And I think that's kind of interesting, and I think it tells you something about how, they've created quite a unique atmosphere up there. They've created quite a unique club, quite a unique organization, where everyone's kind of on the same wavelength and everyone's pulling in the same direction. And I think it's almost like a safer environment for a lot of these players to thrive in. And it's interesting that the man of the match in this game, Jens Petter gave 2 goals, 1 assist, looked brilliant, has had not a great time when he's played abroad at Milan and at Frankfurt. But at Bodo, it's different.
Talking of safe environments where people feel nurtured, I suppose Galatasaray are the other favourites, really, for this competition.
That's a weird segue, Andy.
Isn't it? I think that they had, to an extent, similar teething problems on the first night as United and Porto, but managed to overcome them. They are playing really well against PAOK, who are top of the Greek Super League at the moment, and they've got a decent team. And despite conceding an equaliser against the run of play, managed to pull it around. Now, I guess a couple of things that would recommend them as one of the teams to watch in this tournament is, firstly, they're really good in the Champions League last season. Secondly, Victor Osimhen is, I think it was his best performance so far. He's clearly working off the ring rust, and he could have had a couple of goals. I mean, the opening Galatasaray goal, which was a Baba Rahman own goal in the end, it was probably going in anyway from Osimhen's header in the first place. And then they're able to bring on Mauro Icardi near the end. He scores a brilliant goal, the sort of finish that only really he can score to wrap it up. And I think for these teams, these big teams who should really have this competition as a realistic target, I think the format, Dotton, really helps them out this season. And I don't just mean in terms of the extended group stage.
It did. Explain that, perhaps, Lars. Ultimately, as much as you want to big up Bodo Glimt, the big teams who are in this tournament against them are going to come good in the end, aren't they?
Possibly. But I think a big change to the format, like obviously we don't need to spend a lot of time on the format itself because it is basically the same sort of thing as the Champions League. But the big change is that you're not going to have teams from the Championship dropping in. Not going to have a team for the Championship. Would be interesting if we did have teams from the Championship dropping into the Europa League. You qualify from the group stage, boom, there's Luton away. No, we're not going to have teams from the Champions League. Exactly. We're not going to have teams from the Champions League dropping into the tournament. And that, I don't like it when I end up being in a position where I agree with Jose Mourinho on anything. I feel like in general that's not a great sign in life. But Mourinho complained about this a fair few times over the years, that it feels like not great for the tournament, that you get into it, you play the group stage, and then you sort of come up against, I think he called them the Sharks from the Champions League, who kind of come in and pick you off in the first knockout round. That never quite sat right with me.
Well,
and
significantly,
we're not going to have that now, and I think that's a big positive for the tournament.
but significantly, the teams in the tournament will know who they're up against.
Yeah.
Whereas
It's
before,
huge.
Yeah.
That's the real difference, isn't it? In terms of going forward, the previous iteration of the Europa League, you literally didn't know what was going to come down from the Champions League and who you were going to face.
No, and like if you do well enough in the group stage to go through, your reward is to suddenly get paired with a giant, really financially powerful team from the Champions League who kind of messed up a bit in the group, and there they are. Like that doesn't seem right. So I like this. I think there's an improvement in terms of the format, and really, I think one of the challenges of European club football, globally speaking, is that in the Champions League, you have a small group of, like, they're often referred to as super clubs, but there's a small cluster of groups around Europe who have so much more money than everyone else. You can't really compare them to. Yeah, it becomes almost silly when if you compare the wage bills of like Dinamo Zagreb when they play Bayern Munich. Like the entire Dinamo squad, I think, makes like half of what Harry Kane makes a year. Like this makes no sense this is just the way the club football has gone. You don't really have those giants in this tournament, right? So it is a little bit. You have a few teams like Spurs, like Man United, like Roma, we're getting onto. There's some strong teams in there, but there are not that many matchups in this tournament where you see that team on their best day still probably can't beat that other team. You'll get less of that. I might be going to one of those. Like I'm heading to Tottenham later today to watch them take on Qarabag, which is, I believe, with the bookies, I suspect Tottenham are the odds favourite to win the tournament, and I suspect Qarabag will be one of the biggest outsiders. So that's probably the biggest mismatch on the year. I'm obviously going to watch that because But generally speaking, I think it's an interesting field.
Yeah, I think the thing is, if you're one of those bigger clubs, I mean, I know you and I have talked about this, Lars, before, like how seriously do the Premier League's biggest teams take it, for example. But I think it's easier to work out what you want to do now. It's easier to work out whether it should be a genuine objective, I suppose.
Yeah.
Because you don't have those teams, as you say. Like it's pointless planning a competition as a massive target, and then you might come up against an Inter or whoever drop out in the last 16. So that's something no longer to deal with. I guess the thing is, we always come back to this. The difference and why it was worth identifying those biggest clubs and their start in this Europa League rather than Champions League, which, as Lars said, maybe they should have been in, is that I think it feels as if it will be easier to manage this reshuffled format in the Europa League than the Champions League, because we always say about the Europa League every year, there's a much bigger gap, and Lars sort of touched on it before, between the biggest teams and the weakest teams that there's maybe not normally in the Champions League. Now, I suppose you could look at the Champions League this year and say, you have a Slovan Bratislava or whatever, but that is not something that necessarily happens every single year. Whereas I think if you're a Tottenham, you should be able to cruise through this group stage pretty easily. I reckon I would be staggered if Tottenham didn't make top 8, for example. But then again, there are quite a few of these big clubs as we've identified, because I think particularly in the biggest leagues, I mean, you think of the Premier League in particular, but also to an extent La Liga, you have teams and clubs who would normally be in the Champions League, but there's so much of a swell of contenders at the top that they find themselves in the Europa League consistently. And I think Roma are a good example of that. Athletic, who are playing them later actually at the Olympico, are an example of that. Teams that in other leagues would cruise into the Champions League and do have the players and the squads for it, but because there's such a bun fight for those top 4 places at the top of their domestic leagues, can't quite get in there. And that really is something that contributes to creating this competitive imbalance, certainly in the group stages.
But I think that, like, I know we need to move on from this, but I'd like to touch on a little bit the curious underperformance of the English clubs in this tournament, because one of the things you notice, like, I'm a big believer that, like, finances affect football a lot. You know, you look across the leagues in Europe, the thing that the best predictor of the league finish is usually the team's wage bill. I mean, that tracks pretty closely to where you tend to be, and that should, and in most cases it does, also reflect, you know, this is how it turns out in Europe, and really with all the riches of the Premier League, the guys who don't quite make the Champions League in England are still very, very wealthy teams compared to everyone else they come up against in these tournaments, and they really should be doing very well, but they haven't always. We don't necessarily see English teams go that far in the Europa League. And I do wonder if part of it is the thing that Andy just touched on, like Tottenham and United, who are in it this year, will look at this group and think we should sail through this. But the thing is, if you think that, suddenly you don't. And I think we had an example of this with United against Twente, who, again, I didn't see the full 90 minutes of the game, but Ten Hag is admitting after the game that we weren't giving 100% here. And I do wonder if this is one of the reasons why some of the Premier League teams get unstuck in this tournament, is that they look at the identity of their opponents and they've never heard of any of these players before, and they sort of play in leagues they don't follow, and then you turn up and you give a little bit less than 100%, and maybe you rotate a little bit more than you otherwise would, and then here's the thing, you're not playing a League 2 team in the Carabao Cup. Like, some of these teams are still pretty capable, and that's how you can end up screwing up. I mean, Tottenham went out a few years ago. They managed to go out against the team whose head coach was in prison. Like, there's an incredible proud history of English clubs kind of somehow messing up in this tournament. And I think the key to not doing that is to take it a little bit more seriously sometimes.
Well, as we said last week, we're only in the middle of the Europa League week. This is part of the development of this tournament. So who knows what will happen.
Could be more Scandinavian joy tonight.
It could be.
Malmö playing Rangers.
Could be.
Come on, Malmö.
Well,
apologies to our Scottish listeners.
You apologise. Me and Andy don't have to.